All right, all right. Today we're going to be talking about signal, the way that contrast is generated in your X-ray and CT image. In X-ray, you have your X-rays coming out of the X-ray tube. It's what's called your X-ray beam, right? They're going to pass through the body. As they come out, it's what's called the remnant or the exit beam. In between there, what can happen is the X-rays either can be transmitted. You typically have millions to billions of X-rays in an area this size, and those X-rays are going to be measured, and we're going to figure out where are more of the X-rays stopped and where are more of the X-rays passing through. And the difference between where more of the X-rays stopped and where more are passing through the body, that is the X-ray contrast. The parts where more of the X-rays are stopped, that's what we call high attenuation. The parts where more of the X-rays pass through, that's what we call low attenuation. In X-ray as well, if there's a long path length, that also will lead to higher attenuation. The X-rays come in and they can either pass through the object. If they're just transmitted, we call that passing through the object. If the X-rays stop in the object via photoelectric effect, that is how we can generate X-ray contrast. And if the X-rays are scattered in the object, that leads to a degradation in our contrast due to a background haze in the image. Here is our model signal that we'll talk about. The X-rays are coming in this way. We're talking about just one narrow beam of X-rays coming in. Those X-rays are coming in here. And in this object, we have a background, which is relatively lower attenuation. And we have an area in the middle right here, which is relatively higher attenuation. As the X-rays pass through, they're going to actually get measured on the detector. When they get measured on the detector, there's going to be certain areas right here where you're going to measure a higher intensity. Then behind the area that's of higher attenuation, you're going to measure a lower intensity because more of the X-rays are stopped. Then again, down here, you're going to measure a higher intensity. This plot I have, in the same direction as my little X-rays coming through. I'm going to take that same plot and then turn it sideways here. This is how we usually will plot things because that way we can have our spatial dimension here, the X dimension here in this direction. And then in this direction here, we have the intensity. We take that and then we actually multiply that by a -1, or we invert it, turn it upside down. We are plotting a signal which is proportional to the attenuation. Areas of low attenuation are lower, areas of high attenuation are higher. That's what we're going to make an image of. We take a signal that looks like this, and then we map it to a grayscale space on our monitor that the areas up here are white. We'll define this as white, and the areas down here are dark or black. We're going to generate contrast by looking at the difference between the X-rays which are stopped versus the X-rays which pass through, and then map that to a black and white value. Imagine I just drew a little slice before, but imagine we actually have, again, our X-ray beam coming in. Imagine these are parallel beams of X-rays coming in if we had an X-ray source that was far away. And we had a little block that is in our beam path that is of higher attenuation. The ideal signal that we're going to get is actually just a little square here for our image. In reality, there's several physical effects which degrade that signal. It's not as nice as we'd like. First off, you have your focal spot blurring and the finite size of your detector both contribute to a smoother edge appearance or blurring around the edge. Then you can think about scatter in your X-ray image. Scatter, what that contributes to is a background haze in the image, and this reduces the contrast between this bright area and the background because we've raised up the signal in the background, hence reducing the contrast. For that reason, we typically like to reduce the scatter in our X-ray imaging using, for instance, anti-scatter grids. Finally, quantum noise leads to fluctuations, which also can make it more difficult to visualize the anatomy. All of these things are at play in your clinical images, and you have control over all of them. In the case of the focal spot, you can adjust the focal spot. You can trade off to get the smallest focal spot or the highest resolution for the tasks such as joint imaging, where that is very important. And in areas where you're trying to make it through very large anatomy, you may need to use a larger focal spot. Then the contrast, we can try and improve the contrast by reducing the scatter using an anti-scatter grid. And the radiation dose in your image is what's going to control the relative noise in the image. You can see our videos on MA, for instance, and on KVP, as those are the two big knobs controlling the radiation dose in your image, along with the time of the acquisition. Next, I'm just going to show a few plots here, and these are just if we drew a plot down the middle of those squares in the images that I was just showing you, the plot would look like this. And if it was a nice ideal image, it'd be this nice, what we call a rectangular function, representing that little square that we had. In reality, again, when you have the blurring, you can see the function looks something like this, where it gets blurred out. Then if you add that background haze, this is what we call a low frequency signal that we're adding to the background due to the scatter. If we add that to the background, then the contrast for our object is reduced a little bit. Finally, if you add noise to the image, it's going to look like this, where you have local fluctuations being added on our image signal. Then we take those all together and we can see we start with something nice and tight like this, and we end up with a signal that looks like this. These are things you want to keep in mind as a technologist, because the signal that's being generated has to do with the different physical pieces that you're using, such as the focal spot and the X-ray grid and the amount of radiation dose.